On September 7, 1191, before the sun rose over the eastern hills of Palestine, the Crusader army stirred in darkness. They had been marching south from Acre for more than 2 weeks, covering roughly 69 miles in a careful march designed to avoid the fate of the Crusader army destroyed at Hattin. The night air was thick with the smells of brine and seaweed from the Mediterranean, sweat and horse, and the faint smoke of cooking fires on the supply ships that shadowed them along the coast. Armor and mail chafed at salty skin, and even in the pre-dawn gloom some soldiers felt the heat radiating up from the sand. Ahead, the road wound between the glittering surf and a dark belt of trees, the wood of Arsuf, that ran parallel to the sea for over 20 kilometers. Between forest and surf, the plain narrowed to 1 or 2 miles, barely wide enough for a long column to march without exposing its flanks. Somewhere beyond those trees, according to scouts and rumors, lay an Ayyubid army preparing to strike. Men could hear distant drums and horns and the clatter of hooves, though the enemy remained invisible in the half-light. At the center of the column rode Richard the Lionheart. By most estimates, he led between 10 and 20,000 men, including roughly 10,000 infantry and perhaps 1,200 knights. His forces represented a coalition of Western Europe, Angevins and Bretons, Poitevins and Normans, French and Flemings. The Knights Templar under Robert de Sablé held the vanguard, followed by corps of Angevins and Bretons, Poitevins, and a unit carrying the great standard of the English and Normans. 7 more corps, including French and Flemish knights and the barons of Outremer, filled the middle, and at the rear marched the Knights Hospitaller under Garnier de Nobles. Henry of Champagne, a young but able noble, rode up and down the line relaying orders, while a small troop of Turcopoles, locally raised horse archers, scouted toward the inland hills. Each unit was chosen deliberately. The orders with the most experience of Eastern warfare took positions where Richard expected the fiercest attacks. Behind them lumbered wagons piled with shields and lances, barrels of wine and biscuit, and siege engines that Richard hoped to use one day before Jerusalem's walls. Oxen strained at harnesses, sweating and snorting. Horses snickered and pawed the sand. Men whispered prayers or curses. Discipline was strict. Richard had learned from Hattin that thirst and disorder were deadlier than arrows. He marched only in the cool morning hours, halted near sources of water, and insisted on tight formations. The sea offered an ever-present refuge for the wounded and a source of supply. The column was never more than a few hundred paces from the surf. Yet the left flank was exposed to the forest and whatever lay inside it, and the knowledge of a large enemy army within striking distance weighed heavily. Even in darkness, when the sky was still spiked with fading stars, men felt the pressure of eyes watching from the trees and the prickling of fear under their helmets. The sun lifted slowly above the hills, turning the horizon first gray, then rose and gold. As light seeped into the plain, soldiers saw the world around them in harsh detail. The Mediterranean glittered to the west, throwing back the first rays in dazzling flashes. To the east, the wood of Arsuf remained a solid black-green mass, its edge uneven where pines and scrub reached toward the sand. The column began to move. The Templars in the van carried their black and white banners and advanced at a steady pace, their destriers already sweating. Behind them came ranks of infantry, crossbowmen with bows slung across their backs, spearmen with long ash shafts, and men-at-arms with heater shields painted with family devices. The column's outermost ranks were crossbowmen. Their job was to provide a wall of bolts to keep enemy horsemen at bay. They could reload only slowly, winding their weapons with crank and stirrup, but at short range their bolts could pierce armor and kill horses. Behind them marched spearmen, their shields interlocked, forming a living wall. Further back rode the knights, lances upright for now, helmets, visors raised to catch the faint breeze. Richard's household knights and a reserve troop under Henry of Champagne moved up and down the column, checking ranks and encouraging tired men. At intervals, supply wagons creaked along, driven by teamsters and guarded by crossbowmen. The movement raised dust that clung to sweaty skin and armor. Men coughed and blinked grit from their eyes. As the march settled into rhythm, the heat began to climb. By mid-morning, the temperature was already oppressive, and armor grew so hot that men burned their fingers on mail links.
The water carriers moved constantly, offering flasks to soldiers who dared not leave their places in line. Richard continued to enforce his plan, marching only until the heat became unbearable, resting by noon, and never allowing units to break formation to chase skirmishers. His men followed because they trusted his experience and because they remembered the fate of the Crusader army at Hattin. They also knew that on this narrow plain there was no room to maneuver. If the column broke, horse archers could ride in and cut them down. The men marched with grim determination, staring ahead at the back of the man before them, listening for orders and hoping for the moment when they could finally turn and fight. Some prayed, some sang softly, some cursed. Over all hung the sound of waves, and somewhere beyond the trees, the dull beat of foreign drums. Soon the attack began in earnest.
At first, it was just a few riders darting out from the shadows of the wood, firing arrows and then wheeling away. Then larger bands of Bedouin foot soldiers and Nubian archers emerged, hurling javelins and loosing shafts into the Frankish ranks. Drums and gongs echoed behind them, accompanied by trumpets and high-pitched reed pipes, creating a cacophony designed to unnerve. From the center of the column, the noise seemed to come from all directions. The Saracen horsemen rode light, with small round shields and composite bows. They were masters of hit-and-run tactics, galloping up to within shooting distance, firing, then veering off before a counterattack could reach them. Their arrows struck shields and armor. Some glanced off, others found gaps. Frankish crossbowmen responded by kneeling, winding their weapons and sending bolts hissing toward the skirmishers. Crossbow bolts killed men and horses at short range, and even at distance could penetrate shields. Baha al-Din, watching from the Ayyubids side, later wrote with respect that Frankish infantrymen marched with arrows protruding from their armor like hedgehogs, yet continued to advance. He also noted the fearsome impact of the crossbow, which he said struck down both horse and man. Saladin's plan was to wear down the Crusaders with constant harassment. From late August to early September, his men had shadowed the Frankish column, striking whenever it seemed stretched or when its rear appeared isolated. The narrow plain before Arsuf offered a perfect killing ground. One flank of the Crusader column was pinned against the sea, the other against the woods. If the line broke or a gap opened, Ayyubid cavalry could pour in and slice the army in pieces. On this morning, as the sun climbed and the heat became unbearable, the attacks intensified. Waves of horse archers approached, let fly their arrows, and retreated. When foot archers needed time to reform, javelin men stepped forward and hurled their weapons. The Franks endured quietly, lowering shields, tightening ranks, and waiting for the signal to counter. Richard rode up and down the line, praising his soldiers' endurance, cautioning them not to give in to anger. Casualties mounted nonetheless. Arrows found unprotected faces and thighs. Horses went down with screams. Men cried out as bolts protruded from their limbs. Skirmishers targeted the rearmost units, hoping to slow them and create a space between them and the main body. Richard responded by rotating units, pulling exhausted men back and replacing them with fresh troops. Each time the line compacted quickly, frustrating the Ayyubid plan. Mid-morning turned to late morning. The drumbeat grew louder. The heat shimmered over the sand. The Crusaders' discipline held, but tension mounted. Knights gripped their lances tighter. Infantrymen swallowed dust and prayed. Everyone knew that eventually either the Muslims would find a gap or Richard would order a counterattack. Which would happen first was the question that gnawed at every man's mind.
The critical pressure came on the rear. Recognizing that the crossbow bolts and spear points of the vanguard were less vulnerable, Saladin concentrated his assault on the Hospitallers and the infantry covering them, hoping to grind them down. Drum beats and horn blasts signaled the shift. The Ayyubid right wing, composed of horse archers and heavy Mamluk cavalry, wheeled and surged toward the back of the column. Javelins and arrows darkened the air. Spearmen raised shields overhead, crossbowmen attempted to reload while stepping backward, and knights tried to keep their frightened horses from wheeling around. Some Hospitaller infantrymen were forced to walk backward, keeping their faces and shields toward the enemy so they could block incoming shafts. For hours they endured, but the pressure grew. Garnier de Nobles sent messenger after messenger to Richard, begging permission to charge. According to the itinerarium, Richard refused repeatedly, insisting that the charge must wait until Saladin's army was fully committed. He knew that a premature attack could leave his army scattered and vulnerable. Yet he also understood that morale was faltering. The men were exhausted, overheated, and angered by the constant darts. At one point, the Ayyubid cavalry came so close that some Hospitallers were attacked from both rear and flank at once. Soldiers had to turn and swing their swords at enemies behind them, breaking their own formation to survive.
Near noon, with the sun directly overhead and armor blazing hot, events reached a tipping point. In the rear ranks, 2 knights, traditionally identified as the Hospitaller Marshal and a French knight named Baldwin de Caronne, decided that enough was enough. Without awaiting orders, they spurred their horses through their own infantry lines and into the mass of Saracen horsemen, shouting, "St. George!" Their comrades, unwilling to let them fight alone, followed. The Hospitaller cavalry broke into a charge that rippled forward through the units ahead of them, and soon the French corps that stood just before the Hospitallers also joined the assault. Richard, realizing that the moment he had sought had arrived, gave the signal for a general charge. Trumpets, if they were heard over the din of drums and gongs, sounded. Infantrymen stepped aside to create lanes. Knights lowered their lances and kicked their destriers forward. Some chroniclers claim that Richard had delegated authority to trusted subordinates to seize the initiative if they saw the enemy wavering. Others suggest that the Hospitallers acted in defiance of explicit orders. Either way, the counterattack began. After hours of static defense, the Crusader line, from rear to van, exploded into motion. The Ayyubid attackers, who had been pressing close, suddenly found themselves facing a wall of heavy cavalry. Many had dismounted to shoot more accurately and were trampled. The right wing of Saladin's army, in compact formation, was struck with overwhelming force. Ba al-Din wrote that the rout was immediate. Soldiers turned and fled, trying to reach the shelter of the trees. Richard, at the head of a hand-picked squadron, personally led his knights, brandishing his sword and cutting down opponents in every direction. The Franks advanced in echelon so that each unit supported the one ahead, turning the counterattack into a rolling wave. Saladin and his commanders attempted to rally their men. Taqi al-Din led a contingent of 700 of Saladin's guard in a countercharge, but it was too late. The Crusader charge, once begun, could not be stopped. Within minutes, the Ayyubid right wing broke, then the center wavered. Saladin's bodyguard, once a symbol of his invincibility, was reduced to a handful of riders and a single kettle drummer. The left wing tried to retreat in good order, but the chaos spread. As the Muslim army dissolved, Richard recognized the danger of over-pursuing a mobile enemy. After roughly 1.5 kilometers of headlong charge, he called a halt, regrouped his knights, and then launched a second controlled assault. This discipline prevented the Franks from being lured into the forest where they could be ambushed. A third charge broke any remaining organized resistance. When the dust finally settled, the battlefield was littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. The plain, which that morning had seemed a death trap for the Crusaders, had become the site of a stunning reversal. The aftermath was ghastly. Casualty estimates differ sharply, medieval chroniclers exaggerated wildly, but most historians agree that Saladin's army suffered heavy losses, and Richard's force lost some hundreds, including the knight James d'Avan. Saladin withdrew inland, conceding the coastal plain. In the following days, Richard marched to Jaffa, rebuilt its fortifications, and secured a vital port. The victory restored Crusader morale and prompted Saladin to demolish his own fortresses in southern Palestine, including Ascalon and Gaza. Yet capturing Jerusalem remained out of reach, and political pressures forced Richard to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem and recognized Crusader control of the coast.
The battle's lasting importance lay in demonstrating that discipline and timing could overcome numerical disadvantage, and in preserving a foothold from which the Latin kingdom could survive.
The lessons of Arsuf extended beyond immediate military gain. They showed how terrain can be used defensively and offensively. By anchoring his right flank on the sea, Richard ensured that his army could not be surrounded. By advancing slowly with constant rotation of troops, he neutralized the advantage of mobile enemy horse archers. He demonstrated that a column could maintain cohesion under sustained harassment if morale and supply were maintained. This required strict discipline. Men had to endure insults and arrows without responding. Crossbowmen had to load and fire while moving backward, and commanders had to resist the temptation to chase skirmishers. The battle also illustrated the power of heavy cavalry when timed correctly. The shock of armored knights, once unleashed, could break formations of lighter cavalry, but only if the charge was synchronized and supported by infantry opening gaps. Patience, therefore, was as important as courage. The role of subordinate initiative invites discussion. Did the Hospitallers disobey orders, or were they acting on delegated authority, as some modern historians suggest? Either way, their action forced Richard's hand and showed that flexible command structures could seize fleeting opportunities. Another lesson is the impact of psychological warfare. Saladin's use of drums, horns, and war cries aimed to sap enemy will. The Crusaders' invocation of saintly names at the moment of charge served both as a rallying cry and as a declaration of spiritual purpose. Ultimately, the battle underscores that wars are not won by single engagements. Arsuf was a clear tactical victory with strategic consequences, but it did not deliver Jerusalem. The truce that followed shows that negotiation and compromise were integral to medieval warfare. Modern readers and viewers can take from Arsuf a series of enduring takeaways. Leadership under pressure requires balancing caution with decisive action. Logistics and morale are as important as battlefield maneuvers. Numerical superiority is not decisive if one side is better led and supplied. And victories can be squandered if pursued recklessly or if political contexts are ignored. Arsuf's story thus provides a lens through which to explore leadership psychology and tactical doctrine. Most historians agree on the broad pattern, even if they disagree on numbers. That pattern shows a disciplined army marching under extreme conditions, enduring harassment, and then unleashing a coordinated counterattack to turn the tide. The men who marched along the surf that September morning, who sweated in their mail and heard the clash of cymbals, would not have imagined that their actions would be discussed 8 centuries later. Yet their discipline and bravery remain an example of how preparation, patience, and well-timed aggression can overcome the most daunting challenges. Before the Battle of Arsuf, the Third Crusade had regained momentum by capturing the port city of Acre after a long and bloody siege. That victory followed the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, which had shocked Europe and prompted kings to take the cross. When Philip of France departed the Holy Land soon after Acre fell, Richard found himself in overall command of a diverse army with competing priorities. He chose the coastal road to Jaffa because it allowed supply ships to accompany the army, and because the inland route carried the risk of encirclement. His men remembered that at Hattin, a Crusader army had marched inland without sufficient water and been destroyed. Some chroniclers report that the 70-mile journey from Acre to Arsuf took nearly 3 weeks because Richard insisted on frequent halts for rest and water. Many soldiers were impatient to strike directly at Jerusalem, but Richard argued that without a secure base at Jaffa and a rested army, any advance would be doomed. Modern historians see this decision as an example of strategic patience. By hugging the coast and rotating units, Richard preserved his strength and forced Saladin to attack on ground where Frankish heavy cavalry could be effective.
Both armies entered the plain north of Arsuf, mindful of the lessons of Hattin. Discipline and logistics mattered as much as zeal. Saladin hoped to disrupt the march with continuous harassment, while Richard trusted that his slow march and coastal supply line would keep his men alive long enough to deliver a decisive blow. The success of the Crusader counterattack proved the value of this careful preparation and is still studied as a case where logistical planning and timing determined the outcome of a battle.